Yesterday we were talking about stereotype annotations, and one of its main important annotation is configuration. So in simple words, if you understand about configuration annotation, this is alternate for XML configuration. So in XML, how you configure beans, in the same way you can configure beans in the configuration class as well. Let's say you have a class student, and if you want to configure this student class in XML file, you know how to configure it. Example, if you have a class public class student, in XML approach we use bean tag, we put id and a class name. This is how we configure in XML approach. The same bean you can create by using configuration class. So in programmatic approach, right, instead of XML @configuration, you can call Java approach or programmatic way of configuration. If you want to configure your bean, the student bean, in XML file we used bean tag. Here in this configuration, you have to use @bean annotation. @bean annotation you have to use. Where you have to use? On top of a method. You need to create a method with the private or public access. Access specifier can be anything. Okay. Though if it is a private or public, need not to worry. You can create a bean, usually public. Because whichever configurations we do here in XML file, our intention is we want to use these beans somewhere else by doing dependency injection. Maybe these classes are public classes. So create a bean, @bean, with your required class type. Whatever you mentioned in the class, same thing you need to put as a return type. And here you can put any method name. Create student bean. Put some meaningful name. Create student bean. So how it will create bean? If I put @bean with public student and create student bean, if I put like this, will it create? No. When you use XML based configuration, when you use bean here, and finally when you load it into IOC will create object for it. During runtime, your class will be loaded into class.forName, .new instance, who do all that stuff, IOC. IOC will create object for you. IOC creates object while loading. While loading your XML file, it will create object. Just a minute. So while loading it into IOC, your XML file, IOC will create object for you. Whereas while using programmatic approach, IOC will scan this class. IOC will scan this class, configuration class. Only for configuration class it will create object. So you need to have something like XML file. You need to create a class here, class configuration, myapp_config, something which is alternate to your XML file, So you need to put a class with @configuration. You can consider this is like your alternate to XML file. While loading it into IOC create object to configuration class while component scan. While doing component scanning, it will create object for this configuration class, as you mentioned @configuration, and it will fetch all @bean objects and register into IOC. It will fetch all the objects of @bean. Using @bean, whatever objects you create, right, that objects it will register, but it will not create that object. It will not create this object of student. When you mention @bean with a method, what it will do? If this @bean method returns anything, if it returns anything, that returned value only it will register. If you return null here, it will register null only. If you return null here, it will register null only. If you return an object, it will register your object. So now here, while using Java or programmatic approach, it's your responsibility to create object and return it from @bean method. But while using a bean tag, we need not to worry about creation of object. While loading this XML file, while loading this class, IOC will create object for you. But whereas in @configuration approach, if you need this object, you do create that object here. You create that object and return it. And put @bean tag on top of it. Put @bean annotation on top of it. So this bean also will be considered like IOC bean. However, how it was creating before with XML file, right? Same way it will treat your object. You guys able to get it? Basically, when you use XML approach, IOC will take care of object creation. But whereas in @bean scenario, both are similar. Both are similar in terms of maintenance of your object. You create object or either IOC create object. Both are same. Both are same. If you create object, your object will be registered into IOC in programmatic approach. In case of XML approach, your XML file will be loaded into IOC, then IOC will create object for it. But finally, here this object or this object, both are singleton. One object only will be maintained in IOC. Both object will be registered into IOC only. IOC will maintain that single object in both the scenarios. So which means if I have multiple classes, here, let's say class controller, and if I have class service, and a class DAO, and some utility classes I have. In case of XML approach, how we configured these classes in XML approach, we used bean tag for each class. And we configured this class there. When you switch to alternate programmatic approach, you need not to configure these beans in XML file. In case of XML file, you use to configure bean tags. In case of XML approach, in pure XML approach, you use to create all the classes, whichever classes you required for your MVC application. Controller, service, DAOs, utilities, all that stuff you use to configure it into XML file. In case if you need any dependency injections, you know how to inject them. We can do dependency injection using property tag or constructor tags. We used to inject them in pure XML approach. This is how we used to create beans using XML approach. In case if you want to shift it to Java approach, pure Java approach, the same classes if you want to configure instead of XML file, you have to create a class like how you maintain one single XML file. Here in one XML file, if you are maintaining all your beans, controller, service, DAO, utilities, same way you can maintain all these beans in one single configuration class. You can have a class, application configuration, any name you can put. But on top of this class, you need to put @configuration annotation. When you see configuration annotation, then you can imagine that this is alternate for your XML approach. When you see configuration, you can imagine that this configuration is going to have your beans only, whichever beans you, okay, your configuration is going to have all your beans only. Inside configuration class, you need to put all your bean configuration. Instead of bean tag, you are providing a alternate here. So what you need to do for each bean, if you want to create controller bean, earlier in XML approach, we used to configure that bean using @bean tag. Here you are going to use @bean tag in XML file. Here in programmatic approach, you will use @bean annotation. Under this bean annotated method, you need to create your object, public, with same return type. Whichever class you want to create, for whichever class you want to create object, you need to put that class here with any method name. Create controller object, and here you need to create it. Return with the new keyword, you should create it. Your controller. It's confusing, right? Let me create here. Okay. Just imagine this classes, instead of XML, you are going to use configuration class. So under configuration class, for each of your beans, you need to create one @bean annotated method. For controller, one @bean method. For service class, one @bean method. Create service object. So you need to create service class object and you should return it. And for your DAO, For each of your class, you need to create one @bean method. And for your utility class, create util object. New util. So this is how you should provide alternate for your XML file. So what will happen while scanning this package, right? Configuration annotation is a kind of stereotype annotation. When you give path of this configuration annotated package, let's say if it is there inside a package called your application dot config package, if it is inside something app.config package, what we will do, we will be using component scan context colon component scan base package. We used to pass the package name, or if it is child package, you can use star also. When you put this and when you load it into IOC, when you load this XML into IOC, right? When you load this XML into IOC, IOC will perform scan first. Scan all packages mentioned in context colon component scan. Whatever packages you have given here, that all packages will be scanned. If it find any class with the stereotype, it will create object for that class. So when it performs scanning, it will identify this @configuration class. So immediately it will create app config object. It will create app configuration object. Thereafter, if your class is annotated with @configuration, if you annotate with @configuration, it will execute @bean methods and return objects. Expects, it will expect return objects when it execute @bean methods, right? It will expect returning a object from that @bean method. So it will expect a return object and register it into IOC as like other beans. Like other beans, it will register your @bean return values also. If it return controller, right, this controller will be registered. This service will be registered. This DAO will be registered, and util also will be registered. Excuse me. So overall, how many objects it will create when it perform component scan on this configuration class? One is your configuration object it will create. Then immediately it will execute all your @bean methods and whichever return values it do here, right? So that return values also it will register into IOC. And importantly, @bean method will execute one time only during application startup. This @bean method will execute only one time. Only one time your @bean method will be executed and it will create your objects. I mean, it is not creating, you are creating and returning it. So when you put @bean, so it will expect a object return from there. So that returned object it will register into IOC. And only one time these methods will be executed by IOC. @bean method will execute only one time during application startup by IOC. IOC only will call that methods. If anyone try to call these methods intentionally, it will never execute the code inside. It will never execute that method. If somebody try to call it intentionally also, it will never execute the code inside. Instead, it will return value directly. So if somebody try to call these methods intentionally also, somewhere if you auto void this configuration class, and if somebody try to call create controller object method intentionally, or create service object or DO object intentionally, if somebody try to access that methods also, it will not go inside your code and execute this again new object creation. Instead, what it will do, already this object is registered, whichever bean you returned, that object is registered with IOC, same object it will return. One more time it will not execute your method, because at the rate bean methods should be singleton. At the rate bean methods should be singleton. Only one time this method will be executed, not more than that. So at the rate bean method will be executed only one time by IOC. If somebody try to call intentionally also, you need not to bother, because if they try to call it for this particular object purpose, let them call, it will return same object which is created first. While creation of configuration class object, it will execute all your at the rate bean methods and it will create object for you. So this is how you can do pure Java configuration of your beans. But when it comes to controller classes, service classes, DAO classes or utility classes, we have a separate annotations. While creating this class itself, right? Instead you do this much of configuration. What else you can do is, for each kind of class there is a separate stereotyped annotation. There is a separate stereotype annotation. So while creating your controller class itself, you should have mentioned with @controller. For service class, you should have used @service annotation. For DAO class, given @repository. And for utility classes, we have @component. If I have used these stereotypes for my classes, then why again I should create this beans here using @bean? Not required. When you use pure stereotypes, you need not to create this beans here. So like how you created object, when you mention stereotype, it will create object for you. So if you mention @controller annotation on top of controller, then you need not to create this object, or you need not to keep that bean in XML file. Here also you need not to configure your DAO, utilities or controller classes, because already you mentioned stereotypes. So by default, it will scan your class and it will create object and it will register into IOC only. Finally, it is going to register into IOC only by scanning this classes from your package. Let's say all these classes are part of your some packages like web package, something a root package if you have here. If you consider all these classes are under this root package, by just scanning that package, you can create controller object, service object, repository, and your utility classes objects. And you need not to configure these classes, particularly your controller, utilities, services, repositories. For these classes, separate stereotype annotations given, so you need not to configure to create these objects. You need not to create any @bean methods. You need not to do that because you given stereotype. Automatically these classes will be scanned and objects will be created. Then for what purpose this configuration annotation given? For your MVC implementation classes, when you have a use case to read data from presentation, you need to implement controller. From there to write your business class, you need to implement service. From there to write database code, you need to have a repository. And if you want any validations or some date time conversions, some utilities, you need to use @ component. All these annotations given to implement your API. To implement your API classes, already stereotypes given, controller, service, repository, component. Then when do I get a chance to use @ configuration? Which beans I should configure here? Already we have stereotypes to create all the beans. Then which beans I should put here using @bean? Apart from controller classes, business classes, DAO and utility classes, there will be some third-party libraries we will be using. Not only Spring library, while creating application, you may need to use multiple other third-party libraries also in your application. Or apart from the classes which you are creating for your MVC, like controller, service, DAOs, apart from these classes, you may need to use some predefined classes which are already implemented, not by you, by someone else, which are already implemented as a concrete class and given, but they did not mention any stereotype annotation on top of that classes. For your classes, you mentioned stereotypes. If a predefined classes are there from Spring library or from third-party libraries, which they did not mention the stereotype already. If you want to utilize that classes within your application, then either you should go with the XML approach. There you need to use a bean and you should configure your class there. For example, I want to use a JSON library. JSON library usually it will convert from object to JSON, JSON to object. Google JSON class is there. So JSON, new JSON, using this JSON class, what we can do, in case if you have a JSON object, JSON string, name, email, address, if you have fields, and values, and if you have a class student, if you want to convert from JSON to object or object to JSON, JSON data if you want to populate it into object, or object data if you want to populate it into JSON. For doing conversion JSON to object or object to JSON, we can use this JSON library. We can use JSON library to convert data. So in my application, I have multiple use cases to do this task. In multiple places, I want to do these conversions in my application. JSON to object, object to JSON conversion I want to do by using this JSON library. And this JSON library is from third party. So JSON library is from third party. So you need to use com.google code JSON. Some jar file you should download and utilate. So this is third party jar file that you should use. Let's say if you want to use it, maybe you need to download this, and this jar file you need to keep it into your class path. So here you got this jar file, JSON library. So this is third party class which is already implemented and given by Google library. Inside this jar file we have that JSON class. This JSON class we have there. Now I want to create this JSON class and I want to auto wire this JSON in my multiple controller classes. I have a lot of controllers which are getting input from front end. I have here one student controller, an employee controller, just a minute. Okay, consider you have two classes, student controller and employee controller classes. So these two classes needs that third party JSON class which is part of this jar file. So usually you will add that jar into class path, add jar to class path, via Maven or via your manual settings you can add to your class path this jar file. Under this jar file we have JSON class. This JSON class is part of this jar file. Now I want to use that JSON here. I want to auto wire it. Otherwise I want that object everywhere, JSON object everywhere in my controllers. To do the JSON to object conversion throughout my controllers, I need that object. So the one way is you can create object directly and utilize it. Directly you can create and utilize it. But these objects are going to be prototype. If you create a new object every time, they will be prototype. Instead, if you want to auto wire them, auto wire JSON class at the rate auto wire JSON class if you want to auto wire. If you want to auto wire it, this JSON class should be registered into IOC. To register this JSON class into IOC, what you can do, you can create a configuration class at the rate configuration class app config. You can use at the rate configuration and you can create at the rate bean public JSON create JSON object. And you may create object here, new JSON. So this object will be registered into this object with at the rate bean whichever you created. This object will be registered into IOC. So whichever object is registered, that is ready for auto wiring always. Once you register your classes, right, controller classes, service classes, DAO classes, with the stereotypes or with at the rate bean or with XML approach, once object is registered into IOC, that is ready for auto wiring. So your object can be auto wired now. This JSON object whichever is created here, this object, new object, single time this code will be executed during loading time of configuration class itself. So this JSON new object whichever is created, it will be auto wired everywhere. Let's say if you have 1000 controllers, across 1000 controllers if you have this JSON dependency, it will go on auto wire there. So one single object you can utilize throughout the application. So when you find such classes, which are already implemented and given, from third-party libraries or from your Spring libraries, which are not annotated with stereotypes already. So what you need to do, you need to bring that classes into at the rate bean and you should create objects here. So many classes throughout application we will use inside configuration. Which classes which are not your implementations, which means controller, service, DAOs, utility classes are your implementations. For your application use case, you will implement them. But during your application implement, you may need to use some third-party classes. Third-party classes which are not stereotyped already. which means directly Spring cannot go into that libraries and scan and create objects for them. So will automatically Spring create object for JSON class if you add it into class path? No. If you add lot of jar files into your application, it will not go into each application jar file and create objects for them, because they are not annotated with stereotypes. Now, if you want to use that object in your application, instead you creating objects directly, you may create that objects using @bean. Then these beans also will be registered into IOC. Your container will register this JSON bean as well, and you can utilize it for your application purpose. Not only this, connection pool classes, REST template classes. There are many configuration classes we use from third parties. So all such configurations you can create by using @bean annotation. Okay, you guys able to follow me? Yeah. So remember that for your classes, you have stereotypes. If there are any third party classes when you find that you need to use within your application, then go to app configuration class, which is mentioned with configuration. There create your bean. Use @bean tag, and whichever third party, bring it into your application. Why it will not work? It will work. Bring that jar into your application and put that third party class here, whichever class it is. Third party class, put that class and create object, and create that third party object here. You create it directly, return, use new keyword and create that third party class object. And wherever you want to use this class, just auto-wire and use it. This third party class, if you want to use inside controller, service, DAO or component, use anywhere just by auto-wiring it. You know how auto-wire will automatically inject that object wherever you require. Simple. Okay, let me give an example. I'll give one connection pool example. Okay, tomorrow we will discuss more about connection pool. If not tomorrow, later. Okay. Okay. So the same example we will use. Okay. I think here we have. So we have created one controller with the post method. We are not calling it from UI, just calling from the main method only. So when we call post method with ID, name, email address, from here we want to call this employee service create method. So we are calling this create method of employee service, and employee service calling DAO class save method. Then save, creating connection and saving the data into database. And these three classes, controller class starting with controller, which is stereotyped with @controller, service class with @service, DO class with @repository. And how we are scanning them using component scan. Context colon component scan, giving package name here so that it will scan this package and create object for our three classes. So finally what we are doing, just by loading that XML file, getting controller object and calling the post method. Then from here this call going to controller post, controller to service create method, service create to DAO save method. And finally from here it will return success message or error message. So that success or error message we are printing here. Okay, this looks fine. Now in this application, if I want to use any third party library, let's say here I'm using direct connections, right? Direct driver class I'm loading and getting connection. This is not recommended for any application. Usually connections we should not create. It will give lot of performance gap in your application. It will take a lot of time to create your connection and execute the statement and to close the connection. For real-time applications generally this is not recommended. Direct connection creations are not recommended. So we need to use some connection pool classes. Let's say in this library I have already Apache Commons uh, jar file I have, which is third party like your JSON library. Apache DBCP. Find it if you can. Apache DBCP. Yeah, Tomcat DBCP. In this Tomcat DBCP, this is from Apache library. So in this Tomcat DBCP, we have one connection pool jar file. Connection pool jar, class actually. So that connection pool class will create a lot of connections at a time and it will make it available to application. Instead using direct connection, now I want to use connection pool. Where do I create it? Because it is a third party class, I can't go back to their class and stereotype. I need to create a configuration now. Application configuration and annotate with configuration annotation. And here you need to create. I want to create a connection pool object. The connection pool objects are implementations for data source. In Java API, we have data source interface. This is like your connection interface. Data connection interface will hold one connection. Data source will hold n number of connections. So create connection pool. Mention @b. So for this data source, basic data source is one implementation. Basic data source, BDS. New basic data source. So this is connection pool class. How this connection pool class will work? At a time, it can hold n number of connections. It will hold n number of connections. It is a pool class. How? You need to create all connection configurations to it. Bean dot set a driver class name, oracle dot jdbc dot oracle driver, set URL, set username, password. Maximum connections. How many connections you want? 15. In case if connection not available to the user, user should wait for some time. maximum waiting time, I'll give 2 seconds. Up to 2 seconds, you can hold the user. This is not possible in plain core Java approach. Not possible with the direct connection, but it is possible with connection pool. This connection pool is having 15 connections, means at a time 15 users can hit my application. Parallelly for 15 users, it will open, it will make available connections and 15 users can execute their operations. And meanwhile, if another 15 users come to the application, they will wait for next to 2 seconds. By that time, these 15 connections will be released from the previous users and can be utilized for other users. This is most useful practical approach. So here I created connection pool. Now this connection pool you can use within your DO class. Go to your DO class. Now instead of creating object of connection directly here, what you can do, you can auto wire your data source, which is created in configuration class. And from this data source you can expect connection. Instead of you loading driver and creating connection, you get connection from data source directly. Data source dot get connection will provide you connection. That's it. Remaining code as it is you can put. When you call connection dot close, the connection again will go back to your connection pool only, so that it will be available for the next users. This is most practical approach. So now we understand that if there is any third party library class, that class bean we should create by using @bean here, and that can be auto wide anywhere. That can be auto wide anywhere and we can utilize it. Okay. Now the same example you can run and see. Let me insert one more user. Run it. See, employee DO created, service created, controller created, finally success. Not only that, it created your configuration also. Connection pool also created. Create connection pool method also must be executed. And one configuration object also it will create. Because within configuration only you have your @bean. Insert one more record and see. You can see your configuration object created, DO object created, then your connection pool created, then service created, controller created. Okay, finally I got an exception message. Record not inserted, unique constraint violated message I am getting. The reason is same primary key I used for other user. Finally you can say success. So you can verify. Yeah, Nitish insert. I don't know, record 4 is not there. Why it given? So finally your data inserted here. Okay, so now we realized that for my classes during implementation, let's say if you get a requirement now onwards, implement a use case, read data which is coming from front end, immediately you will be creating a controller class with @controller, and for that controller class you will be creating a service class with @service, and you will be auto wiring that service into controller, and immediately will be created DAO class with @repository, and the DAO will be auto wired here. And apart from these three classes, if you need any configurations, you will be creating a configuration class. There you will be using @bean method with the required object as a return type, whichever object you want to create from third party, and with a method name, you will be creating that object and finally returning it. So this object also will be registered into your IOC and wherever you want to auto wire, like how we auto wired service class into controller and the DAO class into service, you can auto wire your configuration @bean object wherever you want with auto wire. All objects are now registered into IOC and available for your use case. So for your application flow classes like controller service DAOs, you can implement by using straight away by using stereotype annotations. But for third party classes, as you don't have stereotyped already, this basic data source is a predefined class. This class is not stereotyped. This class is not stereotyped. This is implemented by Apache. They didn't use any stereotypes while they are working on it. Even these classes are implemented, almost 15-20 years before. By that time the stereotype annotation is also not available in Spring. So if you are using such classes here, okay, so you can create object of that class directly here using programmatic approach, and you can return it. Finally it will register into your IOC container and you can auto wire wherever you want and you can utilize like this, right? We will be creating many classes in real time, like connection pool classes. We will be creating REST templates, one application to another application when we want to make calls, create REST templates, and you can auto wire wherever you want REST template. Many third-party classes we will use, like as I said, JSON, right? Okay, JSON library not available in class path. If I add, it will allow me to create that being here. Yeah, create a JSON. So this is how you can create all the third-party beans, and you can auto wire wherever you want to utilize them. JSON if you want to use in controllers or service, you can auto wire this JSON there and you can use it. REST template if you want to use in somewhere in your service class or controller class, you can auto wire and use it if you want to make a call to another REST application. Okay, so like this third party objects you can create and register into your IOC using @bean, and you need to do it within the configuration class only. Apart from configuration class, if you use other stereotype annotations like component, sometimes people will confuse with configuration and component, and they will put it under component annotation. When you put @bean under component annotation, what will happen if somebody intentionally try to call these methods, right, it will execute your code one more time and it will create one more object, which means, let's say connection pool, if you take an example, one connection pool object only should be created entire application, and it should be used throughout the application. In case if you put it inside component class instead of configuration class, If somebody accidentally, if they call create connection pool method from their method, you know, somewhere, what will happen? Every time it will go inside this method and it will create new connection pool. Let's say if you have 100 connections in database, if your method is executed 5-6 times, by that time it will consume all your connections, and you don't know where that connections are utilizing. Unnecessarily it will create connections for no use. But if you ensure that your class is your @bean is inside configuration class, if somebody try to call this method intentionally also, you need not to worry. At the loading time only, this bean will be executed and this connection pool object is created. If somebody intentionally try to call this method also, it will not go inside this method and execute it one more time. Instead, what it will do, whatever object it already holded, that object it will return to you instead of executing and recreating object. Okay, so you should be careful while using @bean. It should be part of configuration only. Okay, it should be part of configuration, not in any other annotated classes, only under configuration class. If you go to Spring Boot, right, in Spring Boot we have @Spring Boot application. In Spring Boot there is one more place where you can use @bean is in @Spring Boot application, because @Spring Boot application by default is a configuration that we will see in Spring Boot. Okay, yeah, so that's it for today. I hope you all got the context of configuration and how to use it. Are you guys clear? Any doubts? Yes, you can ask me if you have any doubt. Yes, you can do anything. You can import the Mongo library and create, I mean, connection pool object for Mongo. That I never tried. You can try. Basic data source is for RDBMS. Mongo is a document database. I don't know will it support or not. But yeah, even I never tried MongoDB for the simple CRUD operations. In Spring Boot, I used it with the Hikari connection pool. Maybe you can try. Okay. Yeah, we will discuss about connection pool and JDBC in later discussions. Maybe there we will try. You can remind me. Okay. There we will apply to MongoDB and try it. Between, if you want to see, you can see. Yeah. Yeah. This session will be uploaded, Raman. Yeah. Rajesh was sick yesterday. He was unable to do it. I'll ask him to do it today. Okay. So yesterday session and today's session both will be available. Yeah, example. Yeah, yeah, I will do that. Actually, yeah, I want to create new repository that I was trying before the session. I'll do it. Okay. I'll change the repo and share that new repo URL. Any questions, guys? If no questions, yeah, you can have any number of you can have. No issues with that. No limitation. Okay, let's say for connections related stuff, you want to create one configuration, you can create one configuration for connection stuff, one configurations for third party integrations, you can use that. Okay, one connections for purely some converters like gson and all, you can use another configuration. You can have any number, so there is no limit here. Each bean, if you want to create separately in a separate configuration class also, you can create. Let's say one configuration class only for connection pool, you may create this configuration class like a config connection pool config class, and there create only one @bean method and one configuration for rest template config class. Inside that class put @bean. Again for JSON, you can create one more configuration class and put this being your wish. So if you are creating multiple configurations means that is like multiple XML files. Finally, IOC will treat them like one only. End of the day, when we load all these into IOC, right? Though it is coming from multiple configurations classes or one configuration class, it never mind. It will register all that beings into IOC itself. Okay. Yeah. Yes, we are using in XML file to scan our classes. Who access to your IOC XML only? Via XML only we are telling go and scan. Yeah. Component scan purpose is identify the packages and the scanning. So if you have alternate to this, you can provide that alternate to your IOC. Okay. There should be alternative. If you don't want complete XML file, if you want to avoid, there should be some annotation or there should be some configuration to do this. In Spring Boot, we use 0 XML file, but here let us continue with at least basic configuration. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Go through this example. Value annotation. Can't we use? Yes, you can use at the rate value to get your driver, URL, username, password. Yes, hard coding approach instead of hard coding, right? You can bring that properties into your bean here, right? You can get these properties: your driver name, URL, username, password, maximum active connections, and this one. You try value annotation. You put all these configurations in a properties file, create one extra properties file here, and load it into your IOC by using context colon properties tag. You can load them into IOC context, and once after loading your properties into IOC context, create variable like driver, URL, username, password here in the class level with at the rate value. Under at the rate value, use dollar sign and put your keys. Obviously, that parameters will be loaded from properties file to your B, and you can utilize them. You try it, okay? Already I give an example for at the rate value, right? You guys can try. Yeah. Any questions apart from that? Yeah. So I'll upload this example and we'll share it today, okay? So if no questions, we'll close this session and meet tomorrow, same time, okay? Yeah. Thank you all. See you tomorrow.